everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
It was discovered that Google Images was labeling pictures of Black men as gorillas, right? And Google said, oops. And to their eternal credit, they fixed it right away. But the way they fixed it is a little problematic. They didn't address the underlying racism in image labeling software. What they did was they removed the term gorilla from the set of possible labels, right? So we really need to just do a better job of digging in and understanding what are the complex social problems happening inside our technological systems. What you do when you make a machine learning system is you take a whole bunch of data about the real world, you feed it into the computer makes a model, the model shows the mathematical patterns in the data, and then that model, as you know, can be used to generate new things like images or text. The mathematical model is picking up on the historical patterns of bias in the data.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Meredith Broussard, an associate professor at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute of NYU and the research director of NYU Alliance for Public Interest Technology. Welcome to the show today.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So you say that neutrality in tech is a myth and algorithms need to be held accountable. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, my work in general is about artificial intelligence for investigative reporting. But as part of that, I got involved in public science communication around artificial intelligence because there are a lot of misconceptions about what AI is and isn't. Right. And so people get caught up in kind of Hollywood imagining of what AI is, and they forget the reality that artificial intelligence is just math. It's very complicated, beautiful math. Right. And so when we focus on the Hollywood ideas, it takes away from understanding the very real social consequences of using artificial intelligence. And when you assume that the computer is always right or that the technological solution is superior, you become less able to see the issues of bias that are embedded in our technological systems, right? So the AI systems that we're building today are socio-technical systems, and we really need to think about the way that human problems manifest inside AI systems.
And I think your last statement is spot on, is that it really is a manifestation, and it's much bigger than that, because when we say AI, it's the techniques, it's the processes, the methods that's using statistics and Bayesian neural networks. But the underlying framework is still based on humanity and, of course, the history that we've developed over time. Now, one of the things that you say to those, is that sometimes there are people that indicate that technology reinforces inequality, but this is really more of a glitch. And I wonder if you could kind of elaborate on that term glitch, and is that the right way to define it?
Well, the new book is called More Than a Glitch: Confronting Race, Gender, and Ability Bias in Tech. Because when issues of bias do occur in technological systems, we tend to treat them like glitches, like momentary blips, like they're not important, right? So in computing, we have glitches and we have bugs. And a bug is something substantive that deserves to be addressed, right? A bug can bring a project grinding to a halt, but a glitch is just kind of a flicker. It doesn't really matter, right? You're like, oh, weird thing happened, whatever. So we ascribe different amounts of importance to glitches or bugs. What I'm arguing in the book is that when we see manifestations of bias in technology, we need to treat it as more than a glitch. We need to treat it as a substantive issue. So a really good example of this is when Google Images was discovered. It was discovered that Google Images was labeling pictures of Black men as gorillas, right? And Google said, oops. And to their eternal credit, they fixed it right away. But the way they fixed it is a little problematic. They didn't address the underlying racism in image labeling software. What they did was they removed the term gorilla from the set of possible labels, right? So we really need to just do a better job of digging in and understanding what are the complex social problems happening inside our technological systems. So another example is some reporting by The Markup last year. The Markup, which is a really fabulous algorithmic accountability journalism organization, did an investigation into mortgage approval algorithms. And what they found was that automated mortgage approval algorithms are 40 to 80% more likely to deny borrowers of color as opposed to their white counterparts. And a data scientist might look at this and say, oh, well, it's just the algorithm. Like, what's the big deal? But a sociologist might look at this and say, oh, well, this probably has to do with the history of financial discrimination in the United States and the history of, residential segregation and practices like redlining, because then we can think about the way that this system is constructed, the way the mortgage approval algorithm is constructed, because it's a machine learning system. What you do when you make a machine learning system is you take a whole bunch of data about the real world, you feed it into the computer makes a model, the model shows the mathematical patterns in the data, and then that model, as you know, can be used to generate new things like images or text. It can be used to make predictions or make decisions or evaluate somebody's fitness for a mortgage, right? So the mathematical model is picking up on the historical patterns of bias in the data.
So, well, first of all, the topic that we're discussing isn't new, and I think this has been discussed quite a bit in different forms, academic as well as even mainstream media to an extent. I think, let's go back to a couple of examples you gave. One is around computer vision, and you talked about labeling, and typically you have the manual labeling, right? Mechanical Turks and certainly all the human enablers that's been labeling a lot of these classifiers. But then there's also a systematic approach to labeling like you're talking about. So it actually is teaching the labeling system to label properly. Talk to us about some of the deficiencies there and what are ways that can be better handled.
Well, so I think that we need to just dig into the cultural differences and think more about what are some of the things that are hard for computers to understand. And we need to back off on the fantasy of having a completely algorithmically mediated universe, right? Because behind this fantasy of let's train the model to do everything and let's use Mechanical Turk workers to simulate and let's use reinforcement learning, all of these ideas of let's tune the algorithms so that they are perfect and can replace humans, is part of a greater fantasy of let's get rid of the humans. We can't always get rid of the humans. Human in the loop systems are inevitable when you are dealing with social problems, right? Computers are really great at doing math, and we have this wonderful tendency to anthropomorphize things as humans, right? We attribute human-like characteristics to the Spotify algorithm that suggests songs to us. We attribute human-like characteristics to our pets, right? And this is a lovely thing that allows us to act with empathy, but it's maladaptive when it comes to imagining that we can make a machine that is going to have human-level judgment.
Well, first of all, I think there is a underwriting assumption that some people or entities are expecting these algorithms to be fully optimal and weighted to account for some of these bias. But I think in the real world, and certainly corporations, I think there is a general realism that you can't just simply let these AIs run loose. You need actually a way to be able to oversee that and be able to actually prove it out. And part of the movement in AI has been around transparency and open AI aspects in the regards to being able to actually see how it actually derived at the result and being able to actually look at the different layers in the case of neural nets to understand the process. Talk to us about some of the methodologies that's being employed on an academic R&D and even scientific arenas that's helping to understand how it's coming to that result and being able to figure out exactly where do we need to modify certain things, including ultimately starting from the data set.
That's a really great question. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about this is the way that we need different explanations of AI for different audiences, right? So there is a lot of work around explainable AI. And I'm just thinking about the situation where you could have a conversation about weights and have a conversation about neural nets. And then I'm thinking about the conversation that you have at the bodega or like in the pickup line at school about AI. And those are not places where you're going to have conversations about neural nets and weights, right? So the research in the academic field of explainable AI is very much around, it's a very heavily statistical conversation, which is great and absolutely needs to happen. And then we also need plain language explanations of what's going on inside an AI. So I think one of the things that's important in explainable AI is knowing your audience. I mean, this is something that journalists think about a lot, right? Like one of the challenges of writing about technology is that you have to explain these very complex technical terms in plain language, which is so much harder than I thought when I started doing this a few years ago, right? So inside the academic community, I'm most enthusiastic about the conversations that are happening inside the fact community and inside the algorithmic auditing community. There are, and also at NeurIPS and also at AIES, I'm very enthusiastic about the kind of more advanced methods of explaining AI and explaining fairness inside AI systems. One of the things I think we haven't landed on, though, is plain language explanations of what exactly is happening inside an algorithmic system. So if you go to the Biden administration's blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, one of the things that this blueprint suggests is that when an algorithmic system or decision goes against you, you would have a right to an explanation, a complete explanation. And I think it's going to be really important for that explanation to be in plain language as well as in scientific language in order for the different audiences to be able to understand what's going on.
So I completely agree with you in regards to scaling and adjusting the language to the appropriate demographics or target segments. Now, with that said, let's talk about the informed segments of the general public. I think, again, some of these topics that we're talking about isn't new. And let's say that they understand the dangers and the discrepancies and the inequality. But yet, I wonder if there is true demand or catalyst for action from a policy perspective that then gets cascaded into the R&D, the science, the corporate communities. Do you feel like there is that movement? Again, I'm talking more from the citizens relative to some of the organizations and NGOs that you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, from where I sit, there is absolutely that movement. And I would actually turn the question back on you. Like, is there a desire for it in the in the financial communities that you move in?
I can't speak for them. It's a fairly diverse group, but I guess the question I'm asking is, there's recognition that, for example, let's put aside technology for the time being, that slavery is wrong, right? But it took a lot of effort, and really ultimately it was those that were affected the most that stood up against slavery, as well as certain advocates. And I wonder, for us to really rise above this, it's a really a societal issue, and I think part of the common language that we're talking about is the fact that we need to kind of peel aside the technology jargon to get to the point that we're talking about something that's hugely deep rooted in the historical context of imperialism, ranging from slave trade to institutional racism, and the fact that the United States was founded on Native American genocide and slavery. That glitch that people refer to is deeply rooted in the very founding history of our nation. So, it's more than just movements around algorithms and methodologies and how do you communicate. How do we change people's minds, given the fact that, especially now, there is such polarization from a policy and perspectives on philosophy?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. I think you've encapsulated it beautifully. To my mind, the way in is through stories, through telling stories like the story about the racist soap dispenser, which you've probably seen this viral video. A man with, there are two men, they're in a bathroom. One has light skin, one has dark skin. The man with the light skin puts his hand through the soap dispenser, the soap comes out. The man with darker skin puts his hand through the soap dispenser and no soap comes out. But then he goes and gets a white paper towel, he puts it under, and the soap comes out, right? So the soap dispenser is racist. Why is this? Well, it's not because the engineers intended to make a racist soap dispenser, most likely. It's likely because this is just another manifestation of a very long-standing bias in sensing technology, in computer vision technology. Right? We see this in, for example, camera phone technology, that if you have darker skin, you don't come out as well in digital photography. Well, why is that? Well, computer vision technology is built on top of previous technologies like color film technology, which is built on the back of black and white film photography. Well, there was a problem in color film photography where until the 1970s, if you had darker skin, your skin looked muddy in color photographs. This was because Kodak, the company that invented color film and that had contracts with every color film developing lab, had these things called Shirley cards that they used to tune the lab equipment. And Shirley, which was the name of the model who was on the first card, Shirley was a woman with light skin, and there were primary colors on the Shirley card, but there were not browns. There were not tones of brown on the Shirley card. And so the equipment was tuned to light skin, it was not tuned to dark skin. And the reason that it changed in the 1970s was not because of growing awareness of inequality, growing awareness of, hey, we need to adapt our technologies to make sure that people's civil rights are preserved. No, it was because of furniture manufacturers. Furniture manufacturers told Kodak, listen, we're not going to switch over to printing color catalogs unless our walnut and mahogany furniture looks better, in the color photos, right? So to me, we can start talking about the really deep down embedded human problems of human bias that have been plaguing us for forever. We can do that through telling stories about glitches in today's technologies.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you for helping to encapsulate and demonstrate that. Some argue that we can only train algorithms based on what's available. You talked about some of the mortgage approval algorithms, for example. But that also means that they're inherently biased. So in this context, what's the role of using synthetic data?
So this is something that is not settled science yet. As a data journalist, I find stories in numbers. I use numbers to tell stories. And something that's really frustrating for data journalists is when we want to write a story about something and we go to look for the data and the data is not there, right? So we have to write around that problem. Sometimes we write a story about how the data is missing, right? Sometimes we write a story about the gaps in the data and what this tells us about the messed up situation that we found. Other times we just do an analysis based on the data that we have and call it a day, right? Data scientists do the same thing, right? Data scientists will take the data that they have and they will do analysis on whatever analysis they can on it, and they will call it a day. And that's how they build their systems, right? Which is a completely reasonable way to do your job. But the problem comes when people start imagining that these like inadequate systems are sufficient replacements for the existing nuanced human decision-making system, right? So we can do, we can use mathematical methods to remediate bias, right? Like we can take the mortgage approval algorithms and we can evaluate them before they get released into the world. And we can say, oh yeah, these seem to be biased toward certain groups of people. We're going to, then put a finger on the scale to even things out, right? So we could do that. With synthetic data, you can use synthetic data to test a system, right? But the problem is that you don't really know, because the synthetic data is not true, you don't know if the system is really going to work, right? So one of the things that I wrote about in the book is a situation in schools during the pandemic where bureaucrats decided they were going to use algorithms to assign imaginary grades to real students, right? The students couldn't take the International Baccalaureate exams or the A levels or the these like very high stakes graduation exams because it was the pandemic. You couldn't put kids into a room together. And so instead of, giving the kids a take-home test or like giving the kids an essay assignment, having their teachers grade it, what they decided to do instead was use an algorithm and predict the grades that the students would have gotten if they had taken the standardized test that did not occur, right? And when you say it like that, it sounds absurd, right? So we need to think about that kind of situation. And by the way, the algorithm performed very badly. It predicted that the kids from poor schools would do badly and the kids from rich schools would do well, right? Like it just massively, it just predicted for wealth, which is actually how education statistics work, right? Like kids at wealthier schools have better educational outcomes than kids at poorer schools. Rich kids have better educational outcomes than poor kids. Like it is an unfortunate and inescapable fact, right? So when we use synthetic data, we have to be careful about what we're using synthetic data for, right? So it's toy data, it's made up. So if something works on made up data, it doesn't necessarily work on real people, right? And we're not necessarily diagnosing the problems that are going to arise in a real world situation. That said, there are lots of great uses for synthetic data. Like, it is really cool that it exists and that we can generate it, and that, you know, we can use it for the things that we can use it for. We just can't use it for everything.
All right, so we're almost out of time, but I do have to ask this question, and if you could just limit it to 10, 20 seconds, is generative AI, of course, is the water cooler conversation of town. And how do we counteract the likely rise in disinformation and misinformation, given the fact that they're going to exploit these large language model capabilities to launch campaigns that are going to be much more scalable, cheaper, and more efficient?
I think that we need regulation. I think that people should not be rushing to use generative AI because this particular gold rush is going to flood our information ecosystem with garbage content. It's going to pollute our collective ecosystem, and it's going to render it almost entirely useless, right? If generative AI is used quite as much as people seem to be threatening to do.
All right. So on that note, I have been joined by Professor Meredith Broussard at NYU.
Thank you so much. Great conversation.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.